Right, Paul, do you
Yeah,
want to, I
we
think
should
that's
start.
more or less it now. So do you want to just kick off with a bit of an introduction?
So very briefly, first of all, if everybody could mute, please, that would be great. We're recording this, so and recording picks up every sound. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Hannam. I'm co-chair of Greening Spenning, which covers Spenning, Bramber, and Upper Beeding. And we've really changed in the last year. Greening Spenning's been around for 10 years. So in the last year, we started what we're calling the 2030 project, which is to make our area one of the greenest, happiest and healthiest communities in the UK. And we've, which I think we all could look forward to at the moment. And we have 4 action groups within this. And we have Green Consumer. I know some people from Green Consumer tonight, and Transport and Housing. And the 4th group is Biodiversity, which is looking at the nature, wildlife, and supporting our beautiful area. So for those of you who don't know, so that's a bit of a background, and I'll hand over to you, Ronnie.
Okay, well, thank you ever so much, everyone, for coming along this evening for this first training session for our Phase 1 Habitat Survey, which hopefully will form the basis of everything that we do over the next 10 years. It'll be our baseline to work from. It'll be a way of judging whether what we're doing is successful or not. And it's sort of there's two phases in this. There's the actual survey itself, which hopefully will get started in April. Even with COVID restrictions, we can get out and about by ourselves and do a little bit of surveying. And then with the data that we've collected, we want to create what I hope is going to look like a really impressive nature map of the area, which can be used for all sorts of different things, as an education tool, as a baseline, and to promote what we're doing in the BAG group. So really, really important stuff to start with on this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass you over to Tony, who's going to do our training session. If you can keep yourselves muted, that would be lovely. There'll be a chance to do questions and answers at the end. And I'm losing my voice. It's not COVID, I can assure you that, okay? Well, I hope it's not. I haven't been anywhere. So yeah, Tony, I'm going to pass the whole thing over to you. And can you wake me up in about an hour's time and let me know that you finished, all right?
Yeah, okay, thanks very much indeed. And thanks everybody for coming up this evening. Yeah, my name's Tony Whitbread. Most of you know me anyway. I've had a long background in the Sussex Wildlife Trust. A bit strange actually, because I started my career, oh God knows how long ago, with Phase 1 surveys, working for the Old Nature Conservancy Council, which is now Natural England. So it's great to have the kind of full circle and coming back to where I started. I guess things have moved on, but I'm going to be talking about it as though I was back there about 30 years ago. So I'll just try and share screen. Where's it gone? There we are. There, can we all see that?
Yes.
Great. It might be helpful if you can do it to put your thing on the speaker view or something which reduces the number of people on the side. But what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about community nature maps. It's Phase 1 survey is the kind of technical name for it. Sounds kind of scientific, but basically it's fun with crayons. This is the good part of nature conservation. This is the enjoyable part of doing nature. Now I think we've already had a bit of a discussion around this. A good place to start when you're thinking about what to do in an area is to know what your area has got. It's to try and understand the nature, the habitats, the wildlife that's in your area. Once you have that basic understanding, you can then build on that and make plans and work out what you're going to enhance, expand, etc. But starting with a good survey is a good plan. And fortunately, there is a kind of standard method, a standard methodology for doing these Phase 1 surveys, which has been around for a long time. And as I say, it is fun with crayons. And essentially, it is, moving on, there we are. It is a Phase 1 survey, and this was developed about at least 30 years ago to a standard pattern. It's a standard way of actually describing habitats, mapping habitats, and being able to speak in the same language as everybody else who's doing this. So you end up with a standard habitat map to standard colours, which explains what's there, and everybody can kind of understand it. But essentially, this is a way of, as I say, having fun with crayons, learning what's in your area, and having a walk through the sort of habitats that we actually have in our area. Now, if you get this book, which is I've copied to Ronnie electronically. It's a little bit impenetrable, I suppose. It's written the way that the Nature Conservancy would write books. I think you get to about page 56 before you get to the crayons. But actually, it's quite interesting. So what I'm going to do is try to walk you through some of the habitats that we get in this area. It'll be a condensed form. There is a lot more detail in here. But this one, of course, this book covers the whole of the country. So a lot of the habitats in here you're not going to find. But I'll walk you through some of the habitats, at least some of the habitats that we're likely to get here, and just talk through what that kind of looks like with a few pictures in there to kind of break the monotony and learn a little bit about, you know, what we're likely to find. But as I say, it's all about, this is the sort of thing you're going to end up with. Here's an example from right over in East Sussex, Plumpton Parish, which is it's a long, thin parish, as you probably know. So it's broken into two halves here. And this is the sort of map you'll end up with, a map that's essentially coloured in to represent different habitats with codes on it, target notes on it with more detail and so on, often with associated notes. So you have a map which shows what the habitats are with notes to show what was actually found there. Now I'm going to expand on that today. So this is essentially what you aim for. Now, normally, I suppose you do this we're using a 1 in 10,000 map. That's roughly 6 inches to the mile. But actually, thinking about the parishes or the neighbourhoods you're working in, it might be better to actually get even bigger scale maps, 25 inch even. Now, I understand that the National Park Authority is happy to help us in this work. So it may be that they're going to be the ones that are going to be able to help us provide some of the basis for doing our survey, which is great, because that's what it's going to be, walking around with maps, 1 to 10,000 or 25 inch maps, and actually colouring them in so you get a basis of what's in the area. And as I said, it's fun with crayons, but not just any crayons, you know, it has to be a particular set of crayons. Again, being a government department, they've standardised exactly which crayons you're supposed to use. I dare say in the modern digital age, this might have changed. But the guidance I'm using was from 2016, so it's not that long ago. It's the Beryl Very Thin series from stationers, from good stationers everywhere, or you can order them. But essentially, of course, there's a code against each of these colours, and each of these colours means a particular habitat, and it's arranged they all mean something, and they're all used in a particular way. So what I'm going to do now is just talk you through some of the habitats that I think you'll find and the way they'll be represented on a map. I think you're going to get to the end of this and think, oh, is that all there is to it? I don't think you're going to be very intimidated, to be honest. It's the nice end of nature conservation. So we'll start with my favourite habitat, broadleaf woodland, or woodland in general. And here we are, some of the codes, some of the representation. By the way, the colouring here is probably not particularly accurate because I basically just did screenshots from the document. But we're thinking about woodland. How do you describe woodland? It's probably one of the easiest things to map. A woodland is a woodland. So you have broadleaf woodland. Now you probably know what broadleaf woodland is, the deciduous woodlands, the natural woodlands, the semi-natural woodlands that we get in this county. So the sort of thing you're familiar with. And that breaks down into two halves, semi-natural or plantation. Straight away, I have to say, there's no such thing as a natural habitat left in this country. They're all semi-natural. They've all been influenced in one way or another by management in the past. So we're talking about managed woodlands. We're talking about woodlands that had human influence for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. So they're called semi-natural woodland. On the other hand, you've got plantation, trees which have obviously been planted in one way or another. So there we have the first kind of category that we could map, semi-natural woodland or plantation woodland, but broadleaf woodland. Linked in with that, of course, you've got coniferous woodlands, which are mostly planted in this area, but up in Scotland, of course, you've got semi-natural coniferous woodlands with the Scots pine. But of course, we also have semi-natural woodlands here. You may have some in Steyning, I'm not sure. When you think about yew woodland, that's a semi-natural coniferous woodland. I'm not sure box or juniper would come out as woodland, but I'm not sure how much of that you've got in Steyning or Pulborough. So coniferous tends to be plantation here, and you've got the different notations for that. And of course, if it's mixed, you've got a different notation as well. So moving on, there we are, nice picture of the Men's Nature Reserve, which is a kind of classic, ancient, semi-natural woodland. All the trees there, not obviously planted by a long way, all generated themselves by natural regeneration, you got the whole habitat of nice things that you get with ancient semi-natural woodland, but includes obviously managed woodland as well, like this example here. This is clearly probably a hornbeam coppice with all sorts of things growing underneath it, clearly not planted, but clearly managed. That comes out as a semi-natural woodland. So broad-leaved, deciduous, semi-natural woodland is our first category that I want to talk to you about. And of course, it's not just semi-natural. Plantations are there as well, and they can be pretty obvious. Clearly, the Scots pine woods there you can see, or the Sitka spruce Christmas tree plantations are fairly obvious. But even when they get bigger, you can usually see the rows from when they were planted. If they're Scots pine or anything like it in this county, they were planted or they've regenerated afterwards. So there's another category, coniferous plantation. But of course, it's not just coniferous that are plantation. And here we probably get the first of the quite difficult categories to try and sort out. You are going to get broadleaf plantations as well. And when they get older in particular, they can be quite difficult to discern. Here we have ones which are fairly clear. This is a beech plantation that's getting fairly old. You can almost see the rows still. You know it's a plantation. A couple of things to be aware of here is that people tend to imagine that more was planted than actually was. So you will get stories in woodlands of, oh, this was planted 200 years ago, or this was planted in the Napoleonic period. Often that's not really correct. They were often regenerated naturally. So the guide I tend to use for this is, well, what does it look like? Is there more semi-natural vegetation? Are there more trees there which are clearly not planted? In which case you plump for the semi-natural option. If it's being overtaken by semi-natural vegetation, whether it was planted or not, it's actually a semi-natural woodland. This is one of your first of your confusing categories. There are many woods I can take you to in Sussex where I can walk around, scratch my head. There's one or two planted conifers, clearly planted, some beech trees where I wouldn't expect them, probably planted, but in a mixture of all sorts of things, oak, hornbeam, chestnut, all sorts of things which have probably regenerated themselves. So I always tend to err on the side of semi-natural when I'm in a wood which may or may not be planted. People always think that woods were planted in the past. They weren't. It's a fairly modern thing. However, trees were often selected. So you see oak woods, oaks were often favoured in the management. So even though they weren't planted, they were selected. That's still a semi-natural woodland. But here we are, we see beech plantations quite commonly on the downs. So plantation, broadleaf woodland is a category. Then moving on to parkland and scattered trees, and in particular scrub. We have many examples of scrub, especially on the side of the downs. But if we look at, you'll probably guess where this is. This is the Knepp estate in near Horsham. And that's a lovely example of regenerating continuous scrub with a scattering of trees. And that, should I go back a bit? Let's go back. There we go. The dense continuous scrub notation here is a crisscross of green. And scattered scrub is kind of scatters crisscrosses. But the kind of dots represent parkland trees. So you can easily imagine, in this example from the Knepp estate, of dense continuous scrub with parkland trees emerging from it. So that's a lovely sort of habitat that you can notate when you see it. And then if you look on the side of the downs, this example is from Friston over in East Sussex, you can see nice cases where you have a mixture of fairly continuous scrub mixing in with more open scrub on another habitat as well. So you get the idea of these crisscrosses represented scattered scrub, whereas the kind of cross-hatching representing continuous scrub. In the past, people have thought of scrub as almost a swear word, almost a bad habitat. But scrub, vastly underrated habitat, a really, really valuable thing, often quite transient, starting, stopping, going through change. But scrub is a very valuable habitat, so it's really nice to see. It often changes with time, but that's just what it is, how it works. What have I got next? This one's going to keep you busy. This sort of habitat is a great one to challenge you, because you're going to come across all sorts of different sorts of habitats, all sorts of different sorts of grassland. And again, they're represented by orange in the Beryl Very Thin series, acid, neutral, calcareous. So let's start with that broad categorization. Probably the people that are here are probably going to be more familiar with the calcareous grasslands. These are the chalk grasslands on the downs. basic or alkaline in reaction, because it's calcium carbonate, which is alkaline. Now that really drives the nature of the ecology in this area. There's some of the most rich habitats at a small scale in Europe. You can have 40 species in 1 square metre. So calcareous grasslands, very alkaline, free draining, up on the downs. The other end of the spectrum, the acid grassland, they're also free draining. They're also very thin, very nutrient poor, but on very sandy soils. So you're looking at sandy soils as an acid soil because of the buildup of acidic compounds with nothing to counteract that. So very acidic. In the middle, obviously, because of the term neutral, you have neutral grasslands. Now, yeah, they tend to be medium pH, the neutral reacting grasslands, but it's more than that, because quite often these are the ones with the deeper soils, so more like clay soils. The deeper alluvial soils or the clay soils, you'll get these neutral grassland. So that's the 3 broad categorizations. Now, in the extreme forms, they're quite easy to tell apart. You get all sorts of lovely orchids and things on the calcareous grasslands. Acid grasslands have the fine grasses with things I'm going to show you in a minute. And the neutral grasslands have species which really like the deep soils. So, you know, in their classic form, they can be reasonably easy to identify. But then you get these subcategories, which I've got here, the difference between unimproved and semi-improved. And that's going to occupy your thinking when you're out in the field trying to work out what you're looking at. Unimproved ones are lovely. Talk about calcareous grasslands. Let's talk about the downs because they're the nicest ones in terms of what you look at. Masses of flowers. You can sometimes see more flowering plants than you can grasses in these sorts of things. So semi-improved, great. Unimproved, great. As they become more semi-improved, you get increasing quantities of, shall I say, agricultural grasses. And that's the same with all of these. They start to look a little bit the same. You get more of the more aggressive grasses. If you know your grasses, and maybe in a year's time, even those of you who don't know them will start to get to know them, you'll start to see the more lush agricultural grasses. Things like, timothy grass, foxtail, sweet vernal grass, not the most aggressive, but the sort of things that you tend to get in a semi-improved grassland. Taking it to the further along that extreme to improved grassland, which is at the bottom there with just a big I in it. Improved grass, by the way, improved means agriculturally improved, and that means ecologically wrecked. So let's stick with the improved. Improved grassland is generally dominated by 1 species of grass, and that's perennial ryegrass. So in a whole field, you may get 1 species of grass, maybe with a few other things mixed in with it. So you get this even kind of bluey-green tinge, very little else there. So improved grassland, very easy. Semi-improved grassland starts to be a mixture of the more aggressive grasses with a few of the flowering plants. Unimproved grassland, much reduced quantity of grasses. Even the grasses that are there are non-aggressive, and you get more flowering plants. So that's the general rule. It's clear when you get good examples, but I think when you're out in the field, you're going to be really scratching your head about saying, well, is this improved? Is it semi-improved? Haven't quite got enough there for it to be unimproved, so it'll occupy you. So I'll show you a few examples in a second. The last category there I want to show you is marshy grassland. Some of these categories are quite important because we often use the terms loosely. We call things bogs or marshes or swamps or fens. In this system, they try to be fairly sharp about what we mean by some of these terms. Marshy grassland, I'll explain to you in a second. It's essentially all the above, but when they get very wet. Okay, moving on, let's have a look at some pictures. Here we have classic, unimproved, neutral grassland. So it's in the middle. This is a meadow called Badlands Meadow near the Mens in West Sussex. Wonderful place. It's probably called Badlands Meadow because it was very low in nutrients. So maybe the farmer didn't like it very much. But that's normal. You get the best meadows on the lowest nutrient soils. But the soils are fairly deep, and it's a mixture of the sorts of flowering plants that like deep soil. This is Bethany, the one you can see here. A lot of the yellow, it's St. John's wort. You get various other things mixed in with yellow rattle is a classic plant there. And again, you can't see that many grasses. They're there, but look at the balance. You see, particularly in the middle of early summer, you can really see a lot more flowers in there rather than grasses. I know for the botanists in here, grasses are flowering plants, but I'm trying to draw the distinction here between the things that don't look like flowers, like grasses, and the flowering plants, which have these insect-pollinated flowers on them. So here we are. This is the neutral grassland. And it's neutral in reaction, but it tends to be on clay soils. It tends to be on the deeper soils. We go to one end of the spectrum, then we come across our wonderful unimproved calcareous grasslands. And some of you may be familiar with this sort of site. Pyramidal orchids, there must be loads of them up above Stenning, and I'm sure there's some not far away from us here in Pulborough and Storrington. So you're probably familiar with these sorts of grasslands. And again, they're often, we call them grasslands, but quite often you can't see that much grass in them, certainly in some of the best ones. So again, the unimproved end of the spectrum is quite nice to see. As you start to lose the flowering plants and as it started to be taken over by other sorts of grasses, they may not even be reseeded. They could just be favoured by being fertilised. Then you start to come into the semi-improved category. So that's your calcareous grasslands. And I say these are some of the most, some of the richest habitats at a small scale that you come across in Europe. We're familiar with our cowslips, but you can look at some of these meadows and you just see masses and masses of all sorts of different lime-loving calcicole flowering plants, which is great. So that's one end of the spectrum, at the alkaline, at the basic, at the calcareous end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is acid grasslands. And when I was putting this together, I was trying to think, well, is there anywhere in Stenning that you're likely to come across this? And there probably is, but I guess it might be in small areas. I think there are, for the people from Pulborough here, I think there are some in Pulborough. And I remember seeing some at Nutbourne Common. That seems to be much more like an acid grassland there. Essentially, this is grassland on very sandy soil. It's very thin, very nutrient poor, and it's acidic because it hasn't got any lime to counteract those acidic reactions. And what you'll see here probably is a mass of the very fine-leaved grasses. The species probably don't matter, but in the top corners there, you've got sheep's fescue, which is quite a common grass, a fairly short fescue, and heathgrass, which is less common, but does occur on our acid grasslands. But the kind of jizz of an acid grassland is sometimes given by the plant in the bottom right-hand corner, which is sheep sorrel. It's in the dock family. It actually tastes like apple peel if you eat of it. Probably best not to munch on it, without anybody telling you what it is, just in case you get the wrong thing. But yeah, sheep sorrel. But its flowering spikes, it's in the dock family, it's very small. Its flowering spikes give this kind of purpley, reddy tinge to an area. So you can sometimes look across an acid grassland. It hasn't got anywhere near the flamboyance of a calcareous grassland, so you don't get so many obvious flowering plants. But you can sometimes see this kind of character, very low, very nutrient poor, fine-leaved grasses with this kind of reddy purple tinge of things like the sheep sorrel. The bottom left-hand corner there is I'm thinking the Latgalium saxatile. Heath bedstraw, sorry, yes. That's a little white flowering plant. It's actually in the same family as, goosegrass or cleavers, which is much bigger. Actually, that is an indicator of nutrient-rich soils. This is an indicator the heath bedstraw is a nutrient-poor demander, so you get it in these heathland soils. So quite difficult to describe acid grasslands, but they have a certain jizz to them, which is about really kind of poor soils, not very flamboyant in terms of how many flowers there are there. But as I said earlier, when you start to get these grasslands improved by fertilizers, or sometimes by reseeding, but generally by fertilizers, then they start to begin to look the same, and they start to be taken over by the more aggressive grasses until you get to right at the other end of the spectrum with improved grassland, which is mainly the perennial ryegrass. Okay, moving on. I'm going to use this picture twice in this talk, so bear this in mind. The top, where I've marked it there, that is marshy grassland, the wet stuff. So we're talking about a grassland which is wet. We're not talking about a bog, we're not talking about a fen or a swamp, which will come up later. And the thing to look out for marshy grassland, which really picks it apart, are the rushes. So you'll see rushes in marshy grassland. And actually people even get muddled up with what rushes are, but I'll give you a little saying so you remember the difference between rushes and sedges. Sedges have edges and rushes are round. So the round spiky things that stick out in tussocks, they are generally rushes, whereas the big kind of dominating grass-like things which hurt when you fall on them, they are probably sedges. So round things, they're rushes. you're probably familiar actually with soft rush, which forms tussocks in all these sorts of marshy grasslands quite commonly. You'll see it everywhere. And that's the kind of distinguishing feature for marshy grassland. Wonderful places. Sometimes they're not all that rich in terms of plant species, but they can form a really valuable structure in terms of ground nesting birds, but also for things like small mammals, which can form all sorts of valuable food sources for, somebody mentioned barn owls earlier, for things like barn owls and short-eared owls, which actually like marshy areas. So that's marshy grassland for you. What have I got next? Heathland. Oh, this will be fun. Yes, well, I suppose heathlands, the big areas of heathland are a little bit further away from Stenning and Pulborough. Think Ashdown Forest, think Stedham Common, and you'll get an idea of what these heathlands are like. This is indicated on the maps by a nice yellow colour, yellow ochre. They're generally very acidic. That's what they're like. They're on sandy soils. There is a strange habitat which you may come across, which is quite exciting when you find it. It's called basic there, or alkaline, which seems wrong. It's counterintuitive. It's a thing called chalk heath. How much time have we got? I'll tell you what chalk heath is because it's quite an exciting habitat and most of it has disappeared. Think back to after the Ice Age. The Downs was chalk, and as the winds blew across the chalk, it blew sand across the chalk. Now, in the deeper pockets, the sand settled. In the shallower pockets, it didn't. So you ended up with an uneven layer. So the deeper areas with sand in them, shallower areas which were nearer the chalk. So the deeper areas with sand in them developed a heathy habitat. The shallower areas with chalk on them developed a calcareous habitat. Now, these were in very close proximity, and there are a few places in Sussex where this still happens. Levin Down in the west and Lullington Common in the east are places where you get this really weird mixture. What happens there is you get calcy coal plants, the plants that like basic lime-rich conditions, like, or what can I think of, all the orchids and the dropworts and the thymes and some of the fine-leaved grasses, the squinancy work and so on. These really nice calcy coal plants, you get them mixed up with real calcifuges, which don't like lime, like heather. It's really, ecologically, it's really strange to go across the downs and suddenly start to see heather. Very, very unusual these days. And if any of you find it in your area, I'll be very pleased to hear about it. I think the remnants we tend to find these days are gorse, which is a little bit more, it doesn't mind quite so much where it used to live. But I get the impression that gorse used to be more common in these chalk heath areas. Now that's a very rare habitat, mostly disappeared, mostly destroyed by ploughing actually. So you're unlikely to find it, but I thought I'd taunt you with it for a while anyway. But getting back to the heathlands, if you walk across Ashdown Forest, if you walk across Stedham Common and places like that, you'll know what heathland is. And it's indicated here by a nice yellow ochre. It starts to represent a range of habitats, and they can exist in mosaic. And that's something to consider when we're doing surveys, these mosaics of habitats. The more of a nightmare it is to map, the more good it is for nature conservation, because mosaics are always far better. So acid grasslands and heathlands tend to mix up. You start to get the acid heathlands in the drier, sandy areas, but what happens on the lower slopes when it starts to get wet? You end up with dwarf shrub heath, and that's the other category. When it gets very wet, then you move into a different category altogether, which I'll come across a bit later, which is bog and fen. So, okay, acid heathland in the drier, sandy areas. As you get into the lower slopes, you get into these kind of slightly damper areas. So you move from heather to things like bilberry, maybe sundew, things like that. Some fairly familiar plants, but you start to see the ecological transition moving from one thing to another. I don't know about you, but I find that quite exciting when you can read a landscape and see these transitions. Okay, moving on. Let's have a nice picture. I think that is Stedham Common. So the main picture there with all that lovely flowering heather must be about late July or August or something. Classic picture of heathland. But if you look to the top right there, that's almost a better indication of a mosaic, which is what generally happens. You get, and I'm sure you're familiar, when you walk through a heathland, you get expanses of heather which are difficult to walk through, and then you get the patches which are more grassy. And if you look closely, they are fine-leaved grasses like sheep's fescue, and they have other things mixed in with them, like the sheep's sorrel I told you about, or the heath bedstraw. So you start to see that. So I've seen a thing. This is Stedham Common, which is near Midhurst along the A272. A Wildlife Trust Nature Reserve. If you go out of Stedham, drive west on the A272, you'll see a big area of heathland on your left. Wildlife Trust Reserve, always open, well worth a look, especially later in the year. Yeah, Stedham, that's right. Okay, so moving on, you start to see the importance of these matrices, and you start to see how actually when you're looking at some of these sites, that'll be one of your problems. How do you actually indicate a matrix in your mapping? It's a nice problem to have. So here we have grassland, have acid grassland mixed in with heathland, a fairly classic mosaic habitat. And then we get, I haven't got any pictures of this because it's fairly boring. Extensive swathes of bracken. You're likely to come across this. You can colour it in with a nice terracotta crayon. And again, scattered bracken with little crisscrosses on top of another habitat. I think we all know what expanses of bracken look like. They're fairly common. Actually, they're more common in the heathy areas. So you're less likely to see them here. But I certainly know they're around, for example, in the Nutbourne Common area near Pulborough, and as you go up into the Weald as well. So bracken. There's a thing there which is always a nice title, isn't it? Other. So I think somebody's not muted. If you could make sure you're muted, that might help. Okay, thanks very much. Yes, this category other, and it's other tall herb. Okay, so it sounds a bit vague, but actually if you picture something which is taller than grassland, it's not scrub, it's kind of in between, and it's not bramble either, then you'll get an idea of what I mean. Think about rosebay willow herb, think about great hairy willow herb, think about those sorts of areas you get in disturbed ground, which you can't describe as grassland, they're not yet scrub, but they're quite an interesting mixture of these really tall herbs, maybe expanses of thistle, those sorts of things. They come out as tall herb vegetation. And again, you can indicate those with this terracotta stripy sort of pattern. So they're two, I know you're going to come across these. I think at Abbey Road, for example, I seem to remember walking around that. There was something there which I would class as tall herb vegetation. On the bank, on the flood banks alongside the river there, that was merging into tall herb vegetation. So that's something to think about. Incidentally, while I'm at this stage, the document that I mentioned is worth looking at. It goes into reasonable detail about all of these sorts of plants and all of these sorts of habitats, giving you detail of the plants to expect. Fortunately, a lot of it's in Latin, but I'm sure you can go through that. Once you know the habitats and you know the sorts of plants to expect, then you'll actually build up a picture of what this looks like. Okay, now some fun. I put this in brackets because I think it's unlikely you're going to come across expansive sphagnum bogs on the mountains of Steyning. This is the sort of thing that you expect to see in Wales or the Lake District or Ireland, even more so. Deep peat. So this is peat, which is more than ½ a metre deep, spreading in great expanses over your mountainous regions. Either a blanket bog, where it's expanded over the large areas, or raised bog, where it's so wet the bog actually builds up in a kind of dome. You're not going to come across that, but I think it's most unlikely you will. But I put it in there just to show you the kind of end of the spectrum. This is made of moss, of bog moss called sphagnum. It builds up over long periods to form deep peat, which you've probably heard about when it comes to talking about climate change and so on. There's a lot of carbon stored in peat. Now it's the intricacies that then develop from that I think might be interesting to us here, but in very, very small locations. So again, it's the sort of habitat that will be very exciting to find, which I'm going to talk about now in the next categories. First of these is the flush and the spring. So it's spring vegetation coming out of very acidic situations with deep peat. Now again, you're unlikely to see that, but I'll explain something that you may see, and you'll see what I mean by that. Now, hovering a little bit, just to make sure we know what I'm meaning by the bog mosses, this is sphagnum moss. It's the dictating species and a vast expanse of habitat over much of the Northern Hemisphere. it's quite good to know what a sphagnum moss looks like, even if we don't get much of it here. If you go into the uplands, you'll see it everywhere. It's the stuff, you pick it up, it's all wet, give it a wringing out and loads more water comes out. It holds a vast amount of water and it forms this, this great substrate for all sorts of habitats. So that's fenland, which is made of peat, of deep peat. Okay, so that's the basis of this sort of habitat. The central categories of which you won't get anywhere near Sussex. However, we can break this down a bit further. And I think what you might get is fenland vegetation, the sort of thing which you get in very small areas, where peat has built up to some extent, where you are getting some fenland vegetation. So these will be in 3 sorts of areas, which all sound similar. So it's in basin areas, in valley mires, so it's along valleys. And what's the third one? I think the third one is in naturally damp depressions. So basin areas, river valleys and damp depressions where sphagnum moss builds up and you start to get this really unusual habitat for Sussex. Now, yes, you won't find much of it, but I have seen it at Stedham Common. It does exist on Ashdown Forest, and I have seen it in places around Amberley Wildbrooks, for example, where you do see small areas where sphagnum moss has built up and you're starting to get a small fen develop. Now, they'll be difficult to identify because they can't develop to the same extent as you get in the northwest. But if you come across expanses of sphagnum, this bog moss starting to form, that's quite exciting. It's nice to hear about. The last category there is called swamp, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, and you'll say, ah, so that's what it is. So quite easy to get. There's swamp. So reed beds. Often single species dominant, sometimes including other sorts of emergent plants like what people call bulrush, which is actually greater reed mace, but we'll save that argument for another day. So the reeds, the rushes, the sorts of emergent vegetation. You may see things like purple loosestrife and yellow loosestrife, flowering rush you often get there, the reed grasses as well, reed sweetgrass and greater reed grass and so on. So the sorts of things which you'll know what it looks like when you see it. You may have problems identifying the species other than the normal Norfolk reed, but you'll get the idea of the habitat. And again, it's a really nice habitat when you see it. Used to be quite rare in Sussex, still is quite rare, although some of it is expanding in places. So this is swamp. This is quite nice to see. And then I'm going to introduce you to 2 categories here, which kind of go alongside these wetland habitats, called vaguely marginal vegetation and inundation communities. And I'll also introduce you to another concept here, and that is the target note. When you're doing mapping, it's often quite handy to write a few extra notes about something special that you've come across. And that's what this little kind of red target dot thing is. The map is too small to be able to write much on it. So you put a little target note dot on it. You give it a number, perhaps, you give it a grid reference, and then in your notes, you can describe what you've seen. Now, marginal vegetation by its very nature is very thin, probably too thin to actually map. So you just do a kind of blue line and then put a target note in it. And in your notes, you can say what you've seen. And you might see something like this. The picture I showed earlier, but this is alongside this dike or ditch in Amberley Wildbrooks, and that would be classed as marginal vegetation. A thin strip of stuff growing alongside this ditch. It hasn't formed a swamp. It's certainly not marshy grassland, but it's this marginal vegetation on the edge. And the reason it's quite nice to write a target note about this is you get a lot of diversity, a lot of change in a very thin band. So you can see species changing over a very small distance. And if you get your botany books out, you can actually write down what some of those plants are. But the general structure, the presence of this habitat is a good thing to note, even if you don't know the species. Quite exciting places, so good to see. So that's marginal vegetation. The other one I've got back, let's go back one. The other thing I mentioned there is inundation communities. And again, picture an area of mud on the edge of a kind of lake or pond or something as the water draws back, say it dries out. And picture the sorts of plants that would grow in that. Things like bistort, there's something called toad rush and bulbous rush. These are little plants that crop up in the mud of this inundation zone as the water retreats. So I think you can probably imagine the habitat even if you don't know the plants. And again, that's a quite nice thing to see around the edge of ponds, lakes, reservoirs, and so on. That's inundation communities. Okay, moving on. What have I got next? Oh, running water. Loads of things here. Open water, rather. So running water have this code indigo blue. So that's nice and easy to mark. It's just a line with an arrow to show which way it's running. So that's great. Standing water, again, I would recommend that you probably just say standing water. If you come across standing water, you know what to do. Just colour it in indigo blue. But I'll hover on this for a little bit because the ecological differences here with the different sorts of water are quite interesting. And we don't need to worry about them too much today, but I'll just run you through these quickly. At the top there, eutrophic means nutrient rich. Often it means polluted. Often it means there's vast amounts of algae growing in there. It's green and horrible, and it's excluding everything because the algae is growing like mad. You will probably see that. You will probably see ditches where there's been runoff, where they're naturally nutrient rich, where you'll see lots of algae in the water. Murky and horrible is what it looks like. Mesotrophic, like most meso words, is kind of in the middle. Probably naturally only moderately nutrient rich, probably clay, a clayey bottom, and it'll have some plants in it, some algae and so on. Oligotrophic is very nutrient poor. It's the kind of crystal clear mountain streams that you can probably picture. So not many nutrients and some very specific, quite unusual plants that have evolved for that sort of thing. So that's oligotrophic. You're unlikely to find anything very oligotrophic in Sussex. Dystrophic, you're also very unlikely to find. It's the brown murky stuff that comes out of peatland. So if you imagine a peatland up in Wales or up in the Lake District and the sort of oozes that come out the side, that's dystrophic. Something to consider though is marl. Now you may get this perhaps in some of our chalk streams. Marl waters are those where the concentration of lime is so great, you're actually getting deposits of limestone, sometimes even forming on the plants. So you may even find kind of a brown crystalline deposit forming on the mosses growing in water, and that's effectively limestone being deposited on those plants. Now, I've certainly seen it in limestone waters up in Yorkshire, but it'd be interesting to see whether you get any of that in the is it the Tanyard stream that runs through Abbeyfield? I can't remember, but you may see it on some of our chalk streams. Not sure. Brackish, again, you may find over in the on the edge of the brooks. This basically means salty. So salty, brackish waters cut off maybe from the freshwater springs, maybe left behind some in the gap between here and the sea. So that's running you through the general categories there, and again with their notations. I wouldn't get too bogged down with it to start with, just mark the standing water, but actually ecologically they're quite interesting, worthwhile reading the book on that. Where am I going now? Salt marsh. Well, we haven't got a great deal of salt marsh in our area, but it's worth thinking about because as you go down the Ada Valley, you're going to see salt marsh there. As we go into the Arun Valley further over in this direction, you'll see some salt marsh. This is a habitat I'm not very good at. I don't know this habitat very well. The general structure, the general appearance, I think most people are pretty familiar with. I think this is sea purslane. You come across things like glasswort and all sorts of other plants which require a very salty, kind of muddy, saline area on the coast. Now, we may get strips of this sort of habitat on the seaward side of some of our flood banks along the two main rivers, either the Arun or the Ada. So you may find parts, bits of this sort of habitat, and it's really picked out by the sorts of vegetation that you get. Often, as you can see here, it's another matrix habitat. So you get a matrix of salt marsh with mudflat. The mudflat, the open expanses with no vegetation, the salt marsh of various different forms because it forms a succession in kind of patches mixed in with the mudflat, and again, all determined by the period of inundation by water. Yeah, I've seen a note in the chat line there. Yes, it is zonal. It does change. So you get a zone from the sea, moving through mudflat, moving through early colonizing salt marsh, through to late colonizing salt marsh, right up to marshy grassland, which starts to become terrestrial, and then into your terrestrial habitats. So that's quite exciting. I think that's more or less my last habitat. And where you get to is a map which probably doesn't look entirely unlike Stenning. And you'll start to see how this may come together. You've got the different sorts of habitats there represented by the different sorts of colours. You can see target notes there, which here you will find on associated notes by means of a grid reference. You could, sometimes I like to put a little number by the target note as well to make sure. And you'll see other sorts of notation, like the I means improved grassland, SI means semi-improved. I think there's an A there for arable. There's all sorts of other things you can see in the book, like how are you going to depict the hedgerows, the boundary features, that's all in there as well. And you can start to see how this will all add together to make a habitat map. Oh, the other thing there, the brown stripes going diagonally there, that is this tall herb vegetation I was telling you about. And I guess that is something which is possibly full of willow herbs in this particular sort of example. So you can see how this will build up. And what's more, you can build up more and more. Once you've got the basic map, you can start to describe more and more. Instead of it just being a colour, you can add notes on what are the dominant species. And again, the book helps you here. Unfortunately, it's in Latin, but you'll soon get to know them. There is a notation for abbreviations of the dominant plants you're likely to see. So, for example, an oak wood, which I'll talk about in a second, an oak wood, if you go into a wood, it's dominated by oak. In this area, it will be pedunculate oak, most likely, Latin name Quercus robur. So the notation you use there is QR. So you see a little green box with QR in it. An observer knows that's an oak-dominated wood. So you can start to build this up. If you go any further, it's worth adding on extra notes about that area. So what I'm going to do now is just take you through a Mickey Mouse example. Okay, so this isn't terribly challenging, is it? I mean, you can all do this. This is quite easy. You can walk around with your 6-inch map. You can identify a thing here. Oh, that's a wood. So we've noticed that this is a wood. So we get our crayons out, we colour it in. Great, you've already done a phase 1 habitat survey. But that's just the starting point. It's useful. It's actually not much more than you'd get on an OS, on Ordnance Survey map, but it's a good start. So, okay, and you do this with all your other habitats. Right, we're on our way. What do you do then? Well, okay, so we've looked around and we find, well, it's an oak wood. We looked up in our list of how the Latins notified there, and we come up with QR. So it's an oak wood with the normal pedunculate oak. There's another species of oak in this county which you're likely to come across much more rarely, called sessile oak, and that's Quercus petrea. That would be QP, which would be even more exciting if you came across it. Good, we're on our way. So anybody looking on can say, okay, I know what to expect. It's an oak wood. You can go a little bit further. Maybe in your mapping you noticed a stream. My PowerPoint skills didn't go far enough to be able to stick an arrow on there, but I'm sure you could with your crayons to say which way it was flowing. I've also put in a little target note there. Maybe we were able to look around the wood a little bit and we noticed a patch of early purple orchids. That's rather nice. Why not make a note about it? And maybe other things that you could add in there as you walked around. So you can see you can start to build up a picture at a basic level, because this is just a phase 1 survey, basic level of what you got there. You can go further. You can actually say, okay, I'm going to have a little bit more of a look around in this wood. I'm going to just, make a few very basic notes about what's the main tree species here. Oak, maybe, over hornbeam coppice. That's a very common sort of woodland that you'll find in the Weald of Sussex here. As you wander around, you'll see carpets of bluebells, maybe wood anemones on the lower slopes, and very commonly you'll see patches of ferns and ramsons, the wild garlic along the stream side. That's great. I think most of us could do that. Most of us could build up a picture like that. And what you have in mind is something like this. Now, to an ecologist, looking at just that simple notation, just that simple thing there, that tells me what sort of woodland that is. You haven't seen many species at all. They're all things most people could identify. And yet by looking at that, I can tell that that's almost certainly an ancient woodland. It's probably been managed for a very long time as a coppice. It's the sort of woodland you get on deep clay soils in the Weald, so neither nutrient rich or nutrient poor, not alkaline but not acidic, right in the middle there. So it's on deep clay soils in the Weald. It has a variation of conditions, from moderately dry where the bluebells dominate, to spring waterlogged where the wood anemone dominates, to actually around the bottom of slopes which get wet where the ransoms or wild garlic dominate. So yes, I've set my own homework here, so it's very easy to describe. But I think actually you can all picture this sort of wood. And with a very basic description, you're actually making an ecological statement that an ecologist could come along and really build up a picture of what that wood looks like. And it looks like that. Now, this is a nice easy one with woodland, but you can do the same with all sorts of other habitats. Relatively basic descriptions using the more common species, the things that you've noticed there. Gets a bit more difficult with grassland, I suppose, but I'm sure you'll get there. Relatively simple description can yield a lot of information. I haven't done a full species list. We haven't done a full biodiversity audit. There isn't a six-legged Latin name in sight, and yet you've got some nice information there. So that's the kind of basis for it. And I think I'm going to end there and say thank you very much for listening to my fairly swift walk through of the sorts of habitats that we're likely to come across in Sussex. And I hope I've tickled your interest in having fun with crayons on a map somewhere in Sussex. I'll end share now and see if we have any discussions. And thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Tony. That's brilliant. That's great. I'm just having a look through the...
Oh yes, I haven't looked at the chat, have I? What's the...
Okay. Right, we've got one from Vicky about managed scrub. So Vicky, would you like to just sort of enlarge on what you're going to say there?
Yes, I just didn't catch whether there was a separate category for that. I suppose I'm thinking about the areas on the downland scheme that have been heavily managed for the benefit of biodiversity. Is there a separate category for that?
No, not really.
No.
It's what you see at the time. I think the point I was making about scrub is that it's an inherently transient habitat, usually. So it's usually moving through one thing to another. And you may be unlucky and actually mark something as scrub and 20 years later it's a woodland, for example. So your map changes, but that's part of the fun, isn't it? Yes, when it's managed, it's still scrub. If it's cut down and something else is taking over, for example, like on the Western Estate, where you're actually reducing the amount of scrub in order to encourage chalk grassland, then the habitat changes from scrub to chalk grassland. And again, it's one of those habitats where a mosaic is really nice. Scrub can be really damaging to other forms of habitat when it takes over too much, becomes too dense. It actually attracts nutrients into the soil by deposition. It gets trapped in the leaves itself, so it can change the nature of a habitat. However, you can get various forms of scrub, quite often on the downs as well, where this matrix of slow-growing scrub with grassland is actually extremely rich. That's where you get things like spindle and wayfaring tree and whitebeam and so on. So you can get this nice, rich mixture of scrub as well. I think, yeah, I could talk all day about the ecological relations here, but this matrix of a transient habitat like scrub with a permanent habitat like long-established chalk grassland is a fascinating thing to try and manage to keep it there. So it's an interesting thing. If you think back a long time, that sort of thing would happen by various levels of grazing that goes up and down with time. And on the downs, that scrub would have marched up and down the slope, depending on how much grazing there was.
There's a question from Laura as well about grassland. And how easy will it be to see and identify flowers and flowering grasses and in April? I mean, I think one of the points that needs to be made here is that we can do this survey across the whole of the summer. So there are areas where we know that it would be better to survey them in June, July, August, rather than right at the beginning of the year. Is that right, Tony? You think that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, quite often you can get the habitat right, even if you can't get the species spot on. You can sometimes go in at the wrong time of year, and you can really work out what it's likely to be. But you can also make horrible errors. I remember once in November, I was sent to a site, it was covered in snow, and they expected me to come back with a result. I got it wrong. But so it does happen. But this is what I was trying to illustrate with some of these examples, is that very often you can get a jolly good idea, even if you can't be absolutely exact with the species. It's the fine details of some of the habitats, and you're right, grassland is one of them, where you're likely to be. It's quite easy to get grassland wrong, because especially semi-improved grassland, because it all starts to look similar. It all starts to be dominated by the same grassland species. But you're right, we do this through the year. We can have several cracks at it. We can have a discussion about it. I mean, this is all part of the fun, and see where you end up.
No, brilliant, thank you. So I hadn't realised that it was sort of an ongoing process, so that's really helpful. Thank you.
And a question from Sally about Stedham, presumably. Which common? Oh, no,
yeah.
She's answered her own question, hasn't she? Are you happy with that, Sally?
Yes, thank you. I couldn't quite hear.
Yeah,
okay.
Stedham, I think it's spelled Stedham.
Right.
And it's just to the west of it's just the west of Midhurst. Absolutely compulsory for you to go there, because it's a wonderful site.
Okay.
And one from Gillian about salt marsh, and she mentioned the fact that it's zonal, and would this be reflected in the map? I was going to actually add something about that, because if the only salt marsh we're going to see in this area is if we walk down the river, and it's not, well, I was going to say, is it really salt marsh? Because at low tide, you will have beginnings of some pioneer salt marsh plants, but they may be at certain times, they may be covered by the tide. The ones that are particularly salt resilient. So what do you do about that situation, basically?
Yeah, no, it's inherently a transitional sort of habitat, and commonly along the side of rivers that are tidal, you will get a narrow band of salt marsh, which has the zone fairly compressed. So on the outside, where the seaward side of it, on by the river, assuming it's tidal, assuming it's salty, you'll get things like glasswort, as little kind of salicornia things that you can eat apparently, and very quickly you'll go up the slope quite quickly, and you'll end up with something which is kind of late colonizing, things like sea purslane. So you'll see this transition, and I think the only way to handle that will all come across as salt marsh, but that's actually quite an interesting transition. So the way I would handle that is with a target note, and I would use target notes quite freely. When you want to describe something, put a little dot on there, give it a grid reference and a number, and describe it in your notes, because that's that adds flavour to whatever you're seeing. And I think with some of these sites, I didn't mention it at the time, but some of these things, particularly when you get narrow transitions, it's worth doing a sketch map or a little kind of transect. Just draw what you're seeing. Apart from anything else, in 5 years' time, somebody might come back, have a look, and see how it either has or hasn't changed. That's interesting. I'll just give another example. In Pagham Harbour years ago, we were looking at how the site there was changing, because half of us assumed it was eroding like crazy. The other half assumed it was accreting like crazy and building up. So we had to try and work out, well, how do you work out what's happening there? Can you put in a transect, a line, and actually see what's happening? Because what commonly happens is people have different perceptions, often quite false perceptions, about how nature is changing. So you put in a line, you do a little diagram, and then you have a fixed point which you can refer to. And actually, in the case of Pagham Harbour, we found that it wasn't changing at all. So both half of us were wrong.
Oh, yeah, Vicky's got a question about the Denning Downland scheme, whether or not they've done any surveying. I have been in touch with Matthew, actually, and they've done a certain amount, but probably not as much as they would like to. So hopefully a bit nearer the time, Matthew can, if the situation allows it, the COVID situation, he might be able to take us for another walk round and show us some of the did you go on the one that we organised just before the first lockdown? No,
I didn't. No. But Matthew's a great botanist, so he'll certainly help you with all those things anyway. Yeah. And yeah.
Well,
So this is quite often what we find with projects, is that they're excellent projects, but sometimes they haven't done the broad scale survey to start off with. So doing that broad scale survey is really valuable. And I keep saying that, you know, the simplest information can be the most useful. I mean, if you do nothing else, you just go along, colour a wood in green and take a photograph, that could be useful in 10 years' time. So, you know, I don't want to stress the complexity of this too much.
Okay, a question from Jeff, a strategic question, I suspect. What area are we covering, and do we have a cunning plan to get access to farmers' land? We're taking Bramber as the middle of our survey area, and we're going out about 1.5 miles, or, you know, in 4 directions from the middle of Bramber. Does that make sense? Where's Roger? Because we were.
Yep.
We've got to work this one out, didn't we, Roger? Like we originally said 2 miles, but it was quite a large area to have to cover, so we reduced it to 1.5. So
actually, that was going to be a question to Tony. Actually, Ronnie, if I can jump in. I've just had a look at the little map that we drew. We drew a 1.5 miles circumference or radius from Bramber, and looking at the area, it really is a huge area. And I'm just wondering, it's not a parish, of course. It's 3 parishes and then borders on probably 4 other parishes. So, from Tony's sort of experience, what's the workforce required? What's the manpower required to survey a parish properly? And perhaps, if we do 1.5 miles, it's a 1.5 miles radius, isn't it? So 3 miles across each way. That's a very large parish. Is that doable between sort of a dozen people with some extra helpers?
Yeah, I'd say it's very doable. It depends how much detail you want to go in, but this survey, by its very nature, is not detailed. It's usually a simple walkthrough, a simple discussion of the sorts of notations you're going to use on the map. You know, making notes, that sort of thing. It's not an in-depth thing at all. So I think it is actually very doable, and you could actually cover quite a large area. My recommendation is to start with a large area, but not in too much detail, because you can always come back and do detail later. So you start with a large area, get a rough idea of what the habitats are, and just see what you can do. Regarding the farmers as well, it's a lot of this can be done from a public footpath, because you're not going into any great detail with exactly what's there. However, it's always good to be on the positive side of farmers. I would suggest you don't do this by trespass. You try to make friends with the farmers. You'll always get one question. I've had it for 30 years, and that is, if you do a survey, you'll just come behind my back and designate it a site of special scientific interest. In my view, in 30 years of survey work, that's never happened. It's never happened, even when all the farmers themselves were campaigning for an SSSI to be designated. It still never happened. So people come up with this concern, but it doesn't happen. Could happen theoretically. I just never know it. I would never know it to happen. So it's good to be on the good side of farmers. It's good to actually give them the idea that this it shouldn't be anything threatening to them. In the current climate, it may even help, because it'll be the basis for their future ability to look at funding packages. You know, what they've got there, how they deliver public good, will be something that they could actually benefit from. But if you're denied access, then don't go there. Just leave a gap. It's not the end of the world. And it's no great insult from the farmer either. It's his right. His right to say, no, sorry, I don't want you on here.
And when it comes to sort of delineating the shape of a wood or a stream, do you basically rely on the map itself to have some of that basic detail on? So you don't have to take a theodolite out to measure, you know, the outline of something.
I would rely on the map. You know, depending on how much detail you go into. The fun will start when you're marking the edges of areas of scrub, for example, because nature is fractal. Whenever you think you've got a boundary, you'll find there's another boundary within it. So you'll just have to do your best guesses. And actually, the nature of the boundary between habitats is also very interesting. So again, target notes. You may actually go to the edge of a wood and decide, actually, this is quite interesting. Quite often, the edges of the woods are the richest part in terms of number of species. So you may actually look at that boundary, that transition between one habitat and another. it will probably be what's on the map anyway. You probably won't have to, well, no, you won't have to resurvey a map. That would take you forever. But you could actually make a note of what's on, what the boundary actually consists of. The other thing you may find is that some of the boundaries on the map are not there, so you can mark that as well. And there may be new boundaries which weren't there. So you may have some that have gone and some that have come. So that's the only time where you're likely to be changing what's on the map. It does happen. Hopefully it'll happen more and more as people plant more and you get more hedgerows and things and different sorts of habitats evolving. The worse it is to map, the more difficult it is to map, the better the habitat.
Are there any more questions for Tony?
Are you all enthused to get it, to grasp your crayons and get out there with your map? I feel a bit robbed that we have to do this. Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
We're talking about phase 1 habitat surveys. Dare I ask what phase 2 is?
Yes, I'll give you an idea of that because that is a useful context. The phase 1 is area. Think landscape. This is the whole point about it. It's done in the sort of low level of detail, so you can cover large areas. So it's just what I've explained. It's what sort of habitat is it? What's a vague idea of the dominant species? Those sorts of things. Phase 2 is when you go into that woodland example I was giving you and do a survey of that habitat. So phase 1 is landscape, phase 2 is habitat. You go in there and you actually do a reasonably good survey of what the plant species are. You can then classify what sort of habitat of communities you're finding, again under a standard scheme, and that gives you a phase 2 level survey. Phase 3 is actually when you go down into even more detail and you're starting to lay out quadrats or transects and looking at the details of changes on a small scale. Now, there's variation around those three, but you get the idea.
So when we've got our map then, Ronnie, do we then prioritise parts of that to do the further study in? Is that the plan?
Let's take one step at a time, Roger.
Yes.
Okay. We'll see how many of us have survived the phase 1. And then I think, I mean, this is all, for me, this is all really exciting, actually. There may be some of us that want to go into a bit more depth. But I think, what Tony was saying about the target notes is really important. Build up, try and build up as much of a picture as you can. Vivian, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I just really want to ask actually both the influence of the history of the area, how that influences the botany and the plant species and the habitats, but also vice versa. Once you end up with a map, it's having a bit of interpretation and understanding of what the landscape and the plant species is actually telling us. So I think both ways would be interesting.
Yeah, as you all know, it's a huge influence. I mean, our flora and fauna is quite heavily dictated by past management approaches. As I said, there's no such thing as natural. Everything is semi-natural. It's just how natural versus semi. And I think actually one thing that comes out of surveys like this is the interpretation of what you find there, and that interpretation often is heavily indicates the sort of past management. I just saw in the chat line there was the thing about will this tell us where there are or where there could be wildlife corridors? I think this is a more general question. Once you've got your basis there, once you understand what's there and perhaps why it's there, the interpretation of past history, you can then start to think, well, what could be there? How do we start to join this up? So that's one of the next stages I would suggest, is you can then use this as a basis for how you want to develop the area. Develop in the kind of ecological sense, how you want, where you want to put the corridors, where things may work by being joined up, or where things may work by being a stepping stone. So when you have this basis, you can then use that to work out where you're going in future. And actually, a lot of that would itself be determined by its past management. So you've got a habitat there which has been grazed or cut for a long time. That's the best place to carry on grazing and cutting, and maybe expanding with more areas that are grazed and cut in close proximity. So it starts to add together.
Anything to add?
It'd be much more fun if we were out there looking at the actual plants and animals, wouldn't it? Maybe we'll do that later on.
questions? Can you hear me?
Just about. You went a bit dull
Oh.
then, but
Okay.
any more questions, anyone?
What happens next, Ronnie?
We've got another training session, hopefully outside, and that's in April. Did we decide a date, Tony? I can't remember now.
I can't remember. I think we vaguely said April. I'm not sure we got a date. With current problems,
I was going to say, with you know, it's probably best leaving it flexible at the moment, because we don't know where we're going to be with lockdown, COVID, and all the rest of it. But actually, was it April? Was it a bit earlier than that? It must have been earlier than that, wasn't it?
there is something we're talking about it in the green drinks on the 26th, aren't we? But I just thought of something else that's aware next, and that is we think about going out there and doing the ecology, but this actually has to be supported by an infrastructure, by somebody who's actually getting the maps together and going out and finding the crayons, and then maybe even talking to somebody who may be able to digitize this, of course, and it may be that the Wildlife Trust will be able to do that for us. So it's not just going out there and doing the field work, there's actually some structure to support that. And I think the National Park said they were prepared to find the maps for us, and we'll have to see what we do about crayons as well, whether the Berol Very Thins are still available.
I was planning to try and sort out the map side of it, and I probably want advice on this. I mean, and this is probably not, I mean, I don't know whether this is the right way to go about it. I thought I would start with an OS map, probably a larger scale one, divide it up into grids, and then into a grid, and then I would contact our local printers to see if they could actually print off copies of each section for us to take out in the field. Does that sound like a reasonable start, Tony? Does that sound as though I'm on the right lines?
Oh, certainly, yes, it certainly does. I mean, it may even be that the National Park will print off some for you. That may be better, because I'm not quite sure where we are when it comes to the copyright for printing off maps.
Whereas a license to print off OS maps, but they're not too expensive actually. About £50 allows you to print off.
Not bad. You know, it's just that the National Park has probably already got a license, so they could do it for nothing.
Yeah, that's something to ask Chris Fairbrother about. You know, the contact we've made with him. So yes, I think that's and I'll try and source the crayons as well, and we'll want a sort of definite number of those who are prepared to go out actually in the field and do this before very long. You know, a commitment from you all that you want to do it. And if you know of anybody else who's interested in joining us, the one thing that we need to think about with this is that the hope was it would be a community effort. So perhaps we ought to be just sort of reaching outside the sort of greening, stenning group and seeing if there's anybody else who would like to join us, somebody that perhaps had never thought about doing anything like this. So if you know anybody, you know, do talk to them about it and try and get them enthused about it. I think it can sound a bit daunting when you start talking about surveying, but I don't think a phase one is too bad actually to tackle for a first timer. You've got to start somewhere, and we won't go out alone. Hopefully, we'll go out with a partner. And what might be a good idea is just to actually team up people who feel fairly confident about identifying different species, different habitat types, with people who aren't quite so confident, who are, you know, new to this. And then you can have an argument about things when you're actually out there with the crane poised over the map and you know, try and reach some sort of conclusion. The thing is not to be scared about it. I don't know whether you know, you're nodding, Tony. I hope I'm right on that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. This isn't intimidating at all. It's actually it's a nice way into nature conservation, because you get to know your area, and you start to see what sort of species are kind of dominating in it, and you start to want to know, I think.
Are we going to be allocated a particular area which is just for us, or are we going to overlap so that we can compare notes and afterwards?
I think it probably depends on how many volunteers we end up with and how I divide the map up into grids. I haven't actually gone I haven't thought about that yet. I think you'll probably designated an area, and then we'll try not to overlap too much. But I mean, if somebody has done an area and it's a little bit more complex than they perhaps anticipated it would be, then somebody else can go out as well, have another look at it, and then some sort of consensus can be reached about which category you want to put it into.
I was thinking it might be quite good to overlap because it'll promote a discussion and learning through in that way. But it depends how many people we get, I suppose.
Yes, I think it all depends on that, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on how many people Tony is scared off tonight, really, doesn't it? And I don't think he's scared anybody off. Hopefully.
Hope I'm not too scary.
Okay. Can I say a big thank you to Tony for this? It was really interesting, and he did a really good job at making up. I think everybody feel confident that they can carry this out. So big clap for Tony. All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, and as soon as we've decided on a date for the second training session, I will let you know. But we will leave it for the next month or so, simply because of COVID and knowing where we are with the situation that we find ourselves in at the moment.
Ronnie, would you like to do a plug for green drinks at the end of the month? Because
yeah, I'll do my best. 26, we've got quite a nice lineup. We're going to launch the nature map, actually, and there'll be a little bit about what we're trying to do. Tony's going to bring the map of Plumpton along again to show people outside the greening group what we're hoping to achieve. We've got Chris Fairbrother coming from the National Park, who's going to show us how they map using slightly more sophisticated methods than we do. We've also have Nick Mills from Bramble Brooks joining us. Jeff, is he going to bring some drone pictures with him, do you think?
I think we can encourage them to show some drone pictures. Yeah,
that's another way of recording.
Yeah.
What you've got in terms of habitat.
He's actually offered to be a kind of a drone pilot for this project. So that sounds like a really exciting kind of extra layer to have some drone footage to tell the story that you're uncovering. So I think he'd be very up for kind of working with us on that.
Jeff, can I just say, I saw your email to Nick, so I've already contacted him, and he's agreed to do a drone footage of the Abbey Road area, but I had to ask the parish council for permission, and they said, "Oh, that's great. Can he do some more for the rest of the parish for us?" So they want pictures of the memorial playing field and the park and the recreation ground and the town. Poor Nick's going to be very busy, but he did offer.
Yeah. Well, he's got quite a he hasn't got a day job, has he? Yeah. But I think this could be a fantastic way of kind of engaging the wider public to sort of take a nature flight up the river and have a sort of a narrative of what you can see. I can see a whole series of lovely video clips, especially when the sun comes out. And if we have a story of what's happening on the ground, it'll make a wonderful narrative of what a rich sort of ecosystem we have here. So bring it on.
I hope that sort of thing will encourage people to get out and about around the three parishes and have a really good look at what we have got already. I mean, I think COVID in some ways has helped that. People are out walking far more than normal. But what a nice idea to give them a reason to go out and walk and explore and find out, what an amazing area that we live in, really, and to really enjoy it. And you never know, we might get one or two more volunteers who want to go out and do the surveying as a result of that. It's as Tony says, it's all to do with knowing where you are, what you've got, and about where you live, really. And most people don't think about that half the time. It's connecting with the nature around you. That's the important thing. And if you connect with it, you learn to respect it, to love it, and you want to do something to keep it good, to improve it, and yeah, to look after it. So yeah. Okay, speech Chairman.
You've got your stunning historian lady as well, haven't you? I forget her name now, but anyway, you've got someone in Stenning who's your local historian, isn't it?
Janet, are you thinking about Janet Pennington?
Janet Pennington.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, Janet Pennington. Yes.
Yeah. And we've got an active museum actually thinking about it. They would probably be interested in collaborating with us.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that our map will go up in the museum. Yeah, it's one of the places where it can be displayed. So,
we've got it's a bit frustrating because we've got a whole area of the museum is dedicated at the moment to the results of the 2030 survey. But the museum had to close about a week after we put it up. But they were very, very keen to sort of provide us with some space, and maybe that would be a place we could actually store some of the maps longer term as a public accessibility spot.
Okay, everyone. Well, it's almost 9 o'clock, and those of us who haven't eaten are probably hungry. So yeah, thank you, Tony, very much, and thank you everybody for coming along this evening.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.